Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of the CDL Files, brought to you by Driver's Legal Plan. My name is Marilyn Surber, and I am the Chief Growth and Strategy Officer here at Driver's Legal Plan. And I am joined today by my friend, the president and founder of Truck Safe Consulting, Mr. Brandon Wiseman. He is really the regulatory guru in the trucking space and my go-to if I have any regulatory questions. And so I always feel smarter when I'm done having a conversation with him. And he is here today. He's going to talk with us about the current regulatory environment and things that are going on. And specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about the English language proficiency guidance and what that means for us. We're going to talk a little bit about Derek Bars, who's going to be the new administrator of FMCSA, and just the overall regulatory environment, and get some thoughts and feedback from Brandon. And I couldn't be happier that he's here today. And so, Brandon, welcome to the show. Tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself and kind of tell us your trucking story.
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. Excited to be here with you today. It's glad to hear that you started a podcast. I'm excited about it. See what kind of content you guys start to push out. Will be exciting to watch. So yeah, thanks for having me. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm a transportation lawyer. I don't hold that against me, anybody that's watching. But I've spent my entire professional career representing mostly trucking companies, truck and bus companies on matters of DOT compliance. So helping them to essentially stay out of the crosshairs, both from a regulatory standpoint and also a highway accident standpoint, just keep our roads safer. That's the name of the game. So helping them in various ways, policy reviews, DOT audits, that type of stuff. But the thing I really enjoy doing is pushing out a lot of our own content, training videos, YouTube videos on issues of DOT regulations, and just trying to make those more accessible for the folks that are supposed to be complying with them, helping them to better understand those. So it's kind of me in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We appreciate it. I think, one of the reasons I wanted you to come on and talk about this is there's no shortage of regulations in our industry, and they're always coming at us fast and furious, and they can be complicated and overwhelming. And I always appreciate your ability to kind of break it down to me like I'm a small child so that I can understand it. And so we're hoping for you to do that for our audience today. And so, the English language proficiency is, again, one of those, certainly something that's been in the news and that we've been hearing a lot about, not just recently, but historically too. And so if you could just talk to us a little bit about what that new guidance is and the history and just the evolution. How did we get here and what do we need to know as a driver or a trucking company?
Yeah, it's obviously something that's been in the spotlight over the last several months from when we're recording this. And it's in the spotlight now because it has become particularly politicized in a couple of different senses. Looking at the background of this. So the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations and their predecessors have long required commercial regulated drivers to be able to read and speak the English language proficiently, to be able to converse with law enforcement, and to be able to read road signs. I think it's been codified in the regulations in some form or fashion since the 1930s. And so that component of the regulations is not new. It's always been there. But what is subject to change, and what has changed many times over the years, is how much the agency focuses on that in terms of enforcement. How aggressively is it enforcing that rule across the board? And that's where we've seen fluctuations over the years. So, and particularly within the last decade or so, it has changed quite a bit. And unfortunately, it's changed quite a bit just primarily based on what political party happens to be in office at any given time, which is something you really don't want to see with safety regulations. It really shouldn't be a politicized issue, but it has become one. And so, English language proficiency, again, the rule right now requires that all regulated drivers operating in the U.S. be able to proficiently read and speak English so that they can converse with law enforcement during roadside inspections and also read road signs. Historically, at one point, that was an out-of-service violation. So if a driver was stopped roadside and the officer decided that they weren't proficient in English, then they would be placed out of service, prevented from continuing to operate their vehicle on the road. But then the FMCSA started to come off of that position, and they kind of rolled back the enforcement back in 2015, around 2015, 2016. They issued a memorandum, and in conjunction with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, CVSA, they took it out of the out of service criteria. And so since that time, so for about a decade at this point, it has not been an out of service violation. Drivers could still get cited for it during a roadside inspection, but they would be allowed to continue along their way. They wouldn't be stopped from operating. That all came crashing down here when President Trump in May of 2025 issued an executive order. So this is from the top down. And the executive order directed the US DOT to once again add that violation to the list of out of service criteria in conjunction with CVSA to make that happen, and to do a few other things. And so effective June 25th of 2025, that is when the CVSA, that's the date that the CVSA decided to once again make that an out of service violation. So from then to now, that is supposed to be an out of service violation. If the driver can't proficiently read or speak English, according to the officer's discretion, then they are placed out of service, and that creates all kinds of trouble for that driver and for the carrier that employs them. So that's it.
So that makes a ton of sense. So it's the out of service violation. I mean, because that changes things for drivers and for trucking companies, because getting a ticket that you can pay or dispute down the road is one thing, but being, parked on the side of the road where you can't move until you can demonstrate. I mean, how do you resolve that? If if you can't speak English, you can't learn it, right? You can't probably do something to rectify that on the side of the road, correct?
Yeah, it's $1 million question. How do you put a driver back in service after they've been placed out of service? And the issue stems from the fact that this violation is such a subjective violation.
Right.
So what one officer may think is proficient, another officer down the street may think is not proficient. Mm-hmm. And so, if I'm a driver and I get stopped and placed out of service because this officer thinks I wasn't proficient in English, then if I'm the motor carrier that employs that driver, I can't place him back in service until I'm satisfied that the out of service condition has been rectified. And this is not a unique thing to English language proficiency. Right. Any out of service violation, if my tire's flat, my vehicle is going to be placed out of service. And to get that back in service, what do I have to do? I have to fix the out of service condition. I have to fix the tire. But that's not a subjective thing, right? I fix the tire and I move along my way. But with this, who's to say, and what evidence do I need to have that this driver who was deemed not proficient by this one officer is now proficient such that I can put him back in the truck? That's the $1 million question that we don't have an answer to from anybody. Right. And so my advice to the clients that have asked me that is you got to have some kind of evidence that you've done something. If you're going to put that driver back in service after they've been placed out of service, you better have something. And it better be something substantive, not just you saying that, hey, they spoke to you and you think they're proficient. Ideally, what you would have is some type of English language training certificate that they have gone through a course. And the more substantive...
Working on that, Brandon? Is TruckSafe working on creating that?
I only speak English, so I would be a poor candidate to put that training together. Yeah. But we are we're trying to work out a partnership with, there are several great English language training providers out there. Things like, Babbel and all of these other well-known that have dedicated their entire business model to doing that. So we're trying to work out a partnership with one of them to maybe get some preferred pricing for our clients and stuff like that. But yeah, that's what you need to have, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I haven't heard any rumblings about establishing something like that at like the CVSA level, right? Where like everybody who has roadside would have like, okay, here's this checklist, kind of like, they do for other things. I haven't heard of that. Have you heard any rumblings of that?
Ideally FMCSA would issue some kind of guidance to CVSA and then to law enforcement more broadly about what might suffice as evidence. But I'm not holding my breath that we're going to get anything like that. So, it's going to leave carriers and those drivers in a bit of a pickle. And we're just going to have to figure it out and see how it plays out over time.
Yeah. And I mean, and like you said, it just went into effect June 25th. So there's probably not a ton of stats yet on what that looks like. But have you had any of those calls yet? Like, oh my gosh, my driver's just been put out of service on the side of, has it started happening? Can we tell that it's happening?
It's definitely happening. You can tell anecdotally. I've seen roadside inspection reports where a driver has been placed out of service for English language proficiency here recently. Unfortunately, FMCSA's data lags by a few weeks. So when we're recording this, we don't have any data to suggest how aggressive law enforcement is being across the country on this issue quite yet. At TruckSafe, we are tracking that. We have put together a monthly subscription ELP tracker chart for our clients that are interested in seeing. That includes like a heat map, because I thought that would be interesting way to visualize it, is what states are we seeing the most aggressive enforcement. So if I'm a fleet that's operating in 50 states or 48 contiguous, and then I could see what areas I need to be particularly concerned about. So we'll be tracking that. It's a little too early to tell at this point.
Well, that's great. I mean, because then carriers can make decisions about their business, right?
That's
Of
right.
like, okay, well, we know I'll throw out a state. We were talking about Arkansas earlier. If Arkansas is a hotbed, then we can make adjustments, right, to our routing, right, based on different things. And that's really smart. Well, we appreciate that. Thank you. That was very helpful. I definitely understand it more now. And
you're proficient in it now.
Yeah, it's an exciting time in trucking. So, as we're recording this, we have Derek Bars, who is in DC today, right, being confirmed, and all my sources and everything I know, we expect him to be confirmed without any problems. And I am fortunate enough to know Derek a little bit. Brandon and I both spent time in Florida at the Florida Trucking Association, and he's a longtime member, former Florida Highway Patrolman, and really just a good old boy. You won't meet a nicer guy, right? We're excited. I'm excited. We're going to have an administrator. But Brandon, what are your thoughts on Derek, and just kind of what do you think kind of getting a new administrator in place will, with the under the new administration, what will that do for our industry?
I don't know Derek personally, but I am excited to get to know him. But the first thing I'll say is I don't envy anybody that's taking that position. That's for sure. It's not a position I would ever want.
Right.
Because there are a lot of interest groups that you have to keep happy, as this is no secret in trucking. You've got the safety advocates, you've got the owner operator groups, you've got the motor carrier groups, the trucking associations, all kind of vying for their various interests. And that's, it's a pretty political position, obviously. And so it's just the politics of it is not something I would want to deal with, but obviously it's good that we have people who are willing to take on that burden. And so, I mean, that's the thing with that position. I mean, it's essentially driving the policy of the agency that gets pushed down either from Congress or from the US DOT, and kind of making high level policy decisions of what particular topics do we need to address through our safety regulations and through our enforcement of them. And so that high level leadership is something that the agency has struggled with since its inception. So FMCSA has been around since, I think, the year 2000. And we have cycled through, I think we're up to over a dozen between administrators and deputy administrators and that type of thing. Acting administrators. Yeah. So it's a revolving door, unfortunately. And so some stability in that position would be a welcomed change if we could get that. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, hopefully so. And I think, Derek has a little bit of a different background than at least the administrators who who've been around in my tenure, is, coming from more of that enforcement angle, right? And a more of a boots on the ground practical approach, possibly, versus more of a regulatory or academic, if you will, from a lack of a better word. Is I think we probably will get a little bit of a different flavor, which will be interesting.
Yeah. And particularly at this point in time, when we're talking about an enhanced focus on enforcement through things like ELP and stuff like that. Right. I think it will be useful to have somebody who has that enforcement background and knows the workings of the roadside inspections and how those play out and the issues that inevitably pop up in those inspections. So
I agree. Definitely. I think he'll bring some, kind of bring some of that common sense, right? Which will be great. It'll be awesome. Well, good. Well, what else? Again, what are the other kind of regulatory things that should be on our radar right now?
Well, a couple things, a couple big announcements recently. There was a period of time there for about a year where there wasn't much coming out of FMCSA right around the election. And that's not uncommon, usually, because usually the staff's turning over. usually at the higher levels and at that time. So you usually don't see a whole lot of stuff happening around that time. But now we're in the last few weeks here, we've gotten several big announcements. The big one that I'm watching right now is the transition to how we handle the transmission of medical certification information for CDL drivers. So this is a decade in the making, literally. FMCSA has wanted to steer that towards a fully electronic process.
Mm-hmm.
CDL driver goes in, gets a new med card or medical certification, and have that information then electronically transmitted up to the National Registry of Medical Examiners and then directly to their state licensing agency and associated with their driving record. That's been the vision since 2015 when the regulations were changed. But because that vision involves many different stakeholders, including state licensing agencies having the IT systems available to accommodate that, and the medical examiners having the IT systems to accommodate that. We knew it was going to be a rocky transition to that process. With that said, they've had 10 years, so you would have thought it could have gotten done. Well, that was supposed to go into effect June 23rd of 2025, and it went into effect. And as expected, frankly, it was kind of a botched rollout. That first day that it went live, I literally got 4 calls from medical examiners who had no idea that that was something that had changed. Then they're continuing to follow the old process. They're issuing, paper med cards to the drivers, but under that new process, those are worthless. That's not the proof of their physical qualifications anymore. It literally is not worth the paper it's written on to that driver. And so that leaves that driver in a bad place. It leaves the motor carrier that employs them in a bad place. In light of that, predictably, the FMCSA has had to issue a temporary waiver that's essentially saying until October 12th of 2025, we're going to allow motor carriers and CDL drivers to continue to rely on those paper med cards for a short period of time after they are issued, as kind of even a transition to the transition, essentially. So I'm watching that. That seems to be causing quite a bit of trouble. And then the other big thing that happened recently was several announcements by Secretary Sean Duffy, USDOT Secretary, about what he calls some pro-trucker initiatives that the USDOT and the FMCSA are planning to roll out. When we're recording this, they haven't rolled these out yet, but he announced several new things. The most notable ones would be additional funding for truck parking throughout the United States. I think he announced around $280 million of federal funding for sorely needed truck parking throughout the country. Another big one, what he announced was an elimination of the much derided speed limiter mandate for heavy trucks. So they're not, at least this administration is not going to pursue that. And then some pilot programs for hours of service flexibility that they're looking at. So all of that.
Definitely interesting, though, some of that stuff, which I love it. I love to hear, thinking about outside of the box stuff. And that's interesting on the medical examiners, to your point about the transition to the transition. So as does a lot of stuff, kind of falls to the motor carrier to have to deal with, whether intentional or unintentional. As somebody who used to work in a motor, what I heard you say when we were talking about the medical examiner is it's probably your job then to make sure you're educating medical examiners or hiring new people to issue your med cards. And if you're an over-the-road fleet, that's no short order, right? If you have to find people all over the place. So,
especially if you don't have your preferred vendor, your preferred clinic or doctor that you use, and you're just allowing your drivers to go to any certified medical examiner, then you have the potential of having 100 different ways of handling this. And if I got 4 calls on the first day from medical examiners who had no idea about this change, how many, just looking at that across the country, how many of them are there that don't know about this change process? My advice to fleets and to drivers is if you've got a CDL driver with a med card that's expiring in the near future, you need to call ahead to their clinic or their doctor and figure out, do they know that they're supposed to be doing this new electronic process, and are they prepared for it? And if not, well, in either case, if they are and if they are not, then the driver needs to continue to request a physical med card from that medical examiner and at least have that. And then under this new waiver, that will be acceptable, but only for 15 days after the date that that med card is issued. After 15 days have expired, that med card, again, is worthless, that physical med card. It needs to be associated with their driving record and on a motor vehicle report that the motor carrier runs and places in their DQ file, driver qualification.
Well, it sounds like you're definitely going to have to come back in the next 6 months or so to give us an update on the data with the ELP and then also on this, because I can imagine, I mean, again, I think I can just imagine the trickle down effects that has in practice, and not just today, right? But as drivers' med cards kind of continue to expire and you kind of find out about this as it happens in real time. And so we're going to need some updates on that, probably before the end of the year. But
it's a big deal. I mean, I don't think some drivers and some carriers understand how that plays out if that process is not followed correctly. I mean, ultimately what it leads to, if that CDL driver's medical certification information is not transmitted to their state licensing agency and associated with their record, then they're not going to be physically qualified. They are not physically qualified. And if you continue to use them and they are not physically qualified, then that is huge exposure to you, both from a regulatory standpoint and a highway accident standpoint. And further to that, the states are instructed that if they do not receive the new medical certification information from that driver, then they are to downgrade their CDL. And that driver's left with just a standard operator's license. So not only are they not medically certified, they also don't have the appropriate license to be operating the trucks or the combinations that they're operating. And I can't overemphasize how big of a problem that is for fleets.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's definitely interesting. And, I also think about everything through the lens of, when you think about the pulse in a trucking company right now, things have been slower, freight has not been busy. And so, you have a little bit more time to take care of things like this, or the urgency or the pressure isn't quite the same under the roof of a trucking company, whenever it's not a recruiting crisis or, a freight boom. And so, but that's coming. We know it's coming, if hopefully this year, or if not early next year. And so I think that is really going to compound it, right? When freight picks up all of these things, that we're talking about.
And hopefully you haven't fired your compliance team.
That's right. Will become bigger issues as it gets busier. So fascinating. Well, thank you. I learned a lot today. I'm sure everybody out there listening did. Any closing thoughts for our listeners and viewers today?
No, not necessarily on any of these topics. I mean, my encouragement always to anybody I'm ever talking to about compliance is be proactive on this stuff. Much better to spend a little time bringing yourself up to speed on all of these things that are constantly changing. I would rather you spend that time than trying to have to deal with the things that come on the back end of that, which can cause you a lot of trouble, whether you're a driver or a fleet. So spending a little time to bring yourself up to speed goes a long way. So that's what I would recommend.
And if people want to get a hold of you or TruckSafe, how do they do that?
Trucksafe.com is where you'll find all the things we've got going on. A lot of free content on all of these types of things. So information on what the medical certification process change looks like, what it means for CDL drivers and fleets. We've got all of that on, short videos on our YouTube channel and all other, a bunch of other content on related topics. So trucksafe.com.
Yeah, definitely check it out. And thank you again, Brandon, for coming on. We'll be having you back by the end of the year. And thank you everybody for joining us on this episode of the CDL Files.